If you're fascinated by incredible stories of survival and engineering marvel from World War II, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss these detailed historical accounts. Over the skies of Nazi-occupied Europe in 1943, German fighter pilots developed a lethal expertise in destroying American heavy bombers. They knew exactly where to aim, which systems to target, and how much damage was necessary to send a B-17 plummeting from the sky. But on one mission that would become legendary in aviation history, Luftwaffe pilots executed what they believed was a textbook attack on a flying fortress, tearing open the entire rear fuselage and leaving the aircraft looking more like a flying skeleton than a functional bomber. They watched with satisfaction as the crippled B-17 fell out of formation, trailing debris and smoke, certain they had delivered a death blow. What happened next shattered everything they thought they knew about American bombers. This is the story of how a B-17 with its rear section virtually destroyed somehow remained airborne, how German pilots who witnessed it questioned their own eyes, and how all 10 crew members not only survived but walked away from the aircraft when it finally touched down. It's a tale of engineering resilience, desperate airmanship, and a brutal lesson that would change German tactics and grudging respect for an aircraft that simply refused to die. If you're fascinated by incredible stories of survival and engineering marvel from World War II, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss these detailed historical accounts. The morning of November 9, 1943 broke cold and gray over Basingbourne Airfield in Cambridgeshire, England, as ground crews swarmed over dozens of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses preparing for another deep penetration raid into Germany. The target that day was a ball-bearing factory in Schweinfurt, a city that had already become synonymous with brutal air battles and devastating losses for the 8th Air Force. The raid 2 months earlier in October had resulted in such catastrophic casualties that it was simply known as Black Thursday, when 60 B-17s failed to return and another 17 were damaged beyond repair. Now the Americans were going back, and everyone from the newest replacement gunner to the most experienced command pilots knew this mission would be hell. Among the bombers being prepared that morning was B-17F serial number 4230177. Nicknamed All-American by its crew, a relatively new aircraft that had joined the 414th Bombardment Squadron, 97th Bombardment Group just 6 weeks earlier. The bomber's pilot was Second Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg, a 23-year-old from Alabama who had completed his training stateside and arrived in England in September with the quiet confidence of a young officer who had mastered his craft but not yet been tested by combat. His co-pilot was Second Lieutenant Godfrey W. Enyel Jr., equally young and equally untested. The navigator was Second Lieutenant Samuel R. Barrick, the bombardier Second Lieutenant Leonard K. Weeks, and the engineer and top turret gunner was Technical Sergeant Stanley L. Liptuck. The radio operator was Technical Sergeant Elton L. Melton, the ball turret gunner Staff Sergeant Kenneth L. Williams, and the 2 waist gunners were Staff Sergeant Joseph Santangelo and Staff Sergeant Carl H. Moore, the tail gunner. Occupying what was statistically the most dangerous position on a B-17 was Staff Sergeant Albert F. Covell. These 10 men had trained together, flown together, and developed the kind of bond that only forms when your survival depends absolutely on each other's competence and courage. As dawn broke and the mission briefing began in the operations building, Lieutenant Bragg and his crew learned they would be flying in the lower middle position of the bomber formation, a location that offered some protection from fighter attacks but exposed them to the concentrated fire of German flak batteries. Targeting the formation center, the route would take them deep into Germany beyond the range of friendly fighter escort for much of the mission, meaning they would face German interceptors without protection during the most dangerous phases of the raid. The intelligence officer briefing the crews tried to sound optimistic, noting that recent losses had forced the Luftwaffe to pull back some fighter units for rest and refit. But everyone in the room knew that German fighter pilots would be waiting in force to defend such a critical target. The Luftwaffe had learned through bitter experience that allowing American bombers to strike industrial targets with impunity would cripple Germany's war effort. So they threw everything they had at bomber formations heading for vital installations. At approximately 0745 hours, engines began roaring to life across Basingbourne as more than 300 B-17s prepared for takeoff. The sound was thunderous, a deep rumbling that shook the ground and reverberated in the chest of every man present. Lieutenant Bragg advanced the throttles on All-American and felt the familiar surge of power as the 4 Wright Cyclone engines pushed the heavily loaded bomber down the runway. At precisely the right moment, Bragg eased back on the yoke and felt the aircraft lift free of the earth, beginning the long climb to formation altitude. The bombers circled and assembled into their designated formations, a complex aerial ballet that required precise timing and navigation. By 0900 hours, the massive bomber stream was heading southeast toward the English Channel, climbing steadily to the operational altitude of 25,000 feet, where the thin air and bitter cold would challenge crews for the next several hours. The formation crossed the channel without incident, passing over the coast of occupied France, where German radar installations tracked their progress and relayed information to fighter command centers deeper in Germany. Luftwaffe controllers watched the incoming raid with professional interest, noting the formation size, altitude, and heading. Within minutes, scramble orders went out to fighter units positioned to intercept the American bombers. At airfields scattered across northern France and western Germany, pilots of Jagdgeschwader 1, 2, 3, 11, and 26 ran to their aircraft, pulling on flight gear as ground crews completed last-minute preparations. The primary interceptors were Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s. Single-engine fighters flown by pilots who had honed their skills against British bombers and now applied those lessons to the American daylight bombing campaign. Many of these pilots were aces with dozens of kills to their credit, and they approached the mission with the confidence of professionals who knew their business. Among the German pilots scrambling that morning was Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a veteran fighter pilot with Jagdgeschwader 27, who had 22 confirmed kills and was known for his aggressive tactics and exceptional marksmanship. Stigler had been flying combat missions since the Battle of Britain and had survived encounters that had killed many of his comrades. He understood the B-17 intimately, knew its strengths and its vulnerabilities, and had developed tactics specifically designed to bring down the American bombers efficiently. His preferred method was to attack head-on, using his Bf-109's superior speed to close rapidly with the bomber formation, fire a concentrated burst into the cockpit and forward fuselage, then break away before the defensive guns could track him effectively. This tactic required split-second timing and ice-cold nerves, but it was devastatingly effective. As the American formation penetrated deeper into German airspace, the first fighter attacks began. German pilots had learned that attacking B-17 formations required careful planning and coordination. A lone fighter attacking a formation of bombers flying in tight defensive boxes faced concentrated fire from dozens of 50-caliber machine guns and rarely survived long enough to inflict significant damage. The Germans therefore developed tactics that involved coordinated attacks from multiple angles simultaneously, overwhelming the bombers' defensive capabilities and creating gaps in the formation that could be exploited. At approximately 10-15 hours, as the American formation approached the initial point where they would begin their bombing run, the fighter attacks intensified dramatically. Dozens of German fighters swarmed the formation like angry hornets, pressing attacks from every angle. The sky filled with tracer fire, smoke trails, and the bright flashes of exploding aircraft. B-17s began falling out of formation, some with engines streaming fire, others with huge sections of wing or fuselage blown away. Parachutes blossomed like white flowers against the dark sky as crews bailed out of doomed aircraft. The bomber gunners fired back frantically, their 50-caliber guns hammering out rounds in long bursts that left gun barrels glowing red-hot. Lieutenant Bragg held all Americans steady in formation, feeling the aircraft shudder each time the guns fired, and watching with grim determination as other bombers around him took hits. His job was to maintain formation discipline, hold his position, and get his bombardier to the target so they could drop their bombs accurately. Everything else was secondary. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Eniel, called out fighter positions constantly while monitoring engine instruments and helping Bragg maintain formation. In the nose compartment, Bombardier Leonard Weeks was already preparing for the bomb run, adjusting his Norden bomb sight and calculating the precise release point for their ordnance. The chaos of the fighter attacks was something to be endured, not reacted to, as any evasive maneuvering would disrupt their bombing accuracy. At 10:22 hours, disaster struck all American with catastrophic suddenness. Oberleutnant Stigler, leading a flight of 3 Bf-109s, had positioned himself above and behind the American formation, executing a diving attack that would bring him through the bomber stream at high speed. Stigler selected All American as his target, noting its position in the formation and calculating his approach angle. He rolled inverted and pulled through into a near-vertical dive, building speed to over 400 miles per hour as he plummeted toward the American bombers. At precisely 1,000 yards range, Stigler centered All American in his gun sight and pressed the firing button. His 20mm cannon and machine guns erupted, sending a stream of high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds toward the B-17. Stigler's marksmanship was excellent, and his rounds tracked perfectly onto the target. But in the chaos of combat with multiple aircraft maneuvering in three-dimensional space and split-second timing involved, perfect attacks sometimes go imperfectly. Stigler's rounds hit All-American, but not in the forward fuselage as intended. Instead, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 from another unit, attacking from a different angle and not coordinating with Stigler's flight, collided with All-American at that precise moment. The German fighter struck the B-17's rear fuselage just forward of the tail section, and the impact was devastating. The Bf 109 disintegrated instantly, its wreckage tearing through the B-17's structure like a buzzsaw through cardboard. The entire upper rear fuselage of All-American was ripped open, leaving a gaping wound that extended from just behind the waistgun positions all the way to the vertical stabilizer. The structural members, stringers, and skin were torn away, leaving only the lower fuselage and some internal framework holding the tail section to the rest of the aircraft. From the outside, the B-17 looked as if a giant hand had peeled back its fuselage like opening a sardine can. Inside All-American, the collision felt like the world ending. The impact threw everyone not strapped in against bulkheads and equipment. The noise was indescribable, a shrieking, metal-tearing sound that seemed to go on forever. Tail gunner Albert Kovel, isolated in his position at the very rear of the aircraft, felt the structure around him disintegrate. His compartment separated partially from the rest of the aircraft, held on only by control cables and the lower fuselage structure. He found himself essentially sitting in a tail section that was attached to the rest of the bomber by what looked like threads. The slipstream roared through the destroyed fuselage section, creating a wind blast of over 200 miles per hour that made breathing difficult and threatened to suck anyone not secured right out of the aircraft. Kovel, demonstrating incredible presence of mind, clipped his parachute harness to anything solid he could find and held on, literally for his life. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Bragg felt the impact through the controls and immediately knew something catastrophic had happened. The aircraft lurched violently and the control yoke went mushy in his hands. The tail surfaces were barely responding to control inputs, and the aircraft wanted to nose down and roll to the right. Bragg and Enyel both grabbed the yoke and fought to maintain even marginal control. Behind them, Engineer Sergeant Liptak was already moving through the aircraft, assessing damage and checking on crew members. What he saw when he looked aft made his blood run cold. The entire rear section of the fuselage was gone, simply torn away, leaving a view of empty sky where solid structure should have been. The tail section appeared to be hanging on by sheer luck, flexing and moving independently of the rest of the aircraft. Liptak could see Koval in the tail gunner position, still alive but trapped in a compartment that looked ready to separate completely at any moment. The waist gunners, Santangelo and Moore, had been thrown around by the impact but were miraculously unhurt. They stared in disbelief at the destruction, unable to comprehend how the aircraft was still in the air. The ball turret gunner Williams had been insulated from the worst of the impact by his position under the fuselage. But when he rotated his turret to assess damage, he could see the tail section hanging on by what appeared to be nothing more than hope and prayer. Radio operator Melton attempted to contact the pilot but found the intercom system damaged. He made his way forward manually, climbing through the damaged fuselage to reach the cockpit. When he arrived and reported what he had seen, Lieutenant Bragg faced a decision that would determine whether his crew lived or died. The conventional wisdom said that an aircraft this badly damaged could not possibly remain airborne, and the standard procedure would be to order the crew to bail out immediately before the tail sections separated completely and sent the bomber into an uncontrollable spin. But Bragg looked at his instruments and noted that despite the catastrophic damage, the engines were still running. The controls still responded, albeit sluggishly, and the aircraft was maintaining altitude. He made a split-second decision that defied all logic and training. He would try to fly All-American home. Meanwhile, the German fighter pilots who had witnessed the collision and its aftermath were experiencing their own shock. Stigler, pulling out of his attack dive and looking back to assess the results, saw All-American with its rear fuselage torn completely open, the tail section barely attached, and structural members exposed like the ribs of a skeleton. In his experience, aircraft damaged this severely did not remain airborne. They rolled over and fell from the sky, usually breaking apart completely within seconds. But All-American was still flying. The bomber had dropped out of formation and was descending slowly, clearly crippled, but it had not disintegrated as Stigler expected. He circled his Bf 109 to observe, fascinated and disturbed by what he was witnessing. Other German pilots also observed the damaged B-17, and several positioned themselves for follow-up attacks to finish off the crippled bomber. But something remarkable happened that would later become part of the legend surrounding this mission. Stigler, despite being a Luftwaffe fighter pilot with orders to destroy enemy bombers, made a decision that went against his training and duty. He saw the exposed crew members, saw the desperate situation, and recognized that the men aboard that crippled bomber were fighting for their lives with no ability to defend themselves or threaten anyone. The tail gunner appeared to be trapped in a section that could separate at any moment. The waist gun positions were exposed to the elements, and the gunners were clearly unable to man their weapons. Stigler later stated that shooting at this crippled aircraft would have been like shooting at parachutes, something he had been taught was dishonorable. He made the extraordinary decision to escort the damaged B-17 rather than destroy it. Stigler positioned his Bf-109 alongside All-American, close enough that Bragg and Eniel could clearly see him. The German pilot made eye contact with the American pilots, then made a series of gestures indicating that he would not fire and that they should head for neutral Sweden, which was closer than England. Bragg shook his head and pointed west, toward England. He was taking his crew home. Stigler, demonstrating a humanity that transcends the brutal calculus of warfare, stayed with All-American for several minutes, waving off other German fighters who approached for attacks. He later stated that he could not bring himself to fire on an aircraft so damaged and crew so vulnerable. Eventually, as his fuel ran low and the risks of staying with the American bomber increased, Stigler saluted the American crew and broke away, turning back toward German-controlled territory. He never reported the encounter to his superiors, knowing that his decision to spare an enemy bomber could result in court-martial or worse. Back aboard All-American, Lieutenant Bragg and his crew faced a desperate situation. The aircraft was flying, barely, but the damaged tail section created enormous aerodynamic drag and made the bomber almost uncontrollable at speeds below about 160 miles per hour. The flight controls were damaged, with several cables partially severed, and Bragg and Eniel had to maintain constant pressure on the yoke to keep the nose up. The aircraft wanted to enter a dive or a spin, and only continuous effort by both pilots kept it in level flight. Engineer Liptak moved through the aircraft, organizing the crew and assessing options. The most critical question was whether the tail section would remain attached long enough to reach England. Every moment brought the possibility of complete structural failure. The slipstream forces acting on the damaged structure were enormous, and the metal was visibly flexing and vibrating. Liptak rigged lines and cables in an attempt to provide additional support, knowing his efforts were probably futile but determined to do something, anything that might increase their chances. Tailgunner Kovel remained in his isolated position, unable to safely move forward through the destroyed fuselage section without risking being swept away by the wind blast. He could see the ground 20,000 feet below through gaps in the structure around him, and he could feel the tail section moving independently from the rest of the aircraft. It was like sitting on the end of a whip being cracked, with every motion of the main fuselage transmitted and amplified to his position. Kovel later described those hours as the longest of his life, sitting in a metal coffin that could separate and fall away at any second, unable to do anything except hold on and trust that his pilot could work a miracle. The flight back across Germany and occupied France was an ordeal beyond description. All-American could not maintain formation altitude and descended slowly to about 15,000 feet, where the air was thicker and provided slightly better control authority. The aircraft could not fly faster than about 180 miles per hour, without the tail section's vibration becoming so severe that structural failure seemed imminent. This slow speed made them vulnerable to further fighter attack. But remarkably, no German fighters engaged them after Stigler's escort. Perhaps the sight of the bomber's damage convinced other pilots that it would crash anyway, or perhaps word had spread through German fighter command about Stigler's actions and other pilots chose to let the crippled bomber attempt its hopeless flight. The crew maintained absolute silence on the intercom, each man focused on his duties and trying not to think about the odds against them. Navigator Barrett calculated a course that would take them across the channel at the shortest possible distance, minimizing their time over water where ditching the damaged aircraft would certainly result in casualties. Bombardier Weeks had jettisoned their bomb load over enemy territory to reduce weight, and he now assisted with navigation and monitored the skies for further fighter attacks. The gunners who could still reach their positions maintained watch, though with the tail section barely attached and the waist positions exposed to the slipstream, effective defense was impossible. As All-American approached the English Channel, the situation deteriorated further. One engine began running rough, showing signs of damage from debris that had been thrown into it during the collision. Bragg had to reduce power on that engine, which created an asymmetric thrust condition that made the aircraft even harder to control. He and Eniel were now physically exhausted from the constant effort of holding the bomber in controllable flight, their arms aching and hands cramped around the control yoke. But they could see the coast of England ahead, and that sight provided motivation that transcended physical exhaustion. The bomber crossed the English coast at 13:47 hours, nearly 3.5 hours after the collision that should have destroyed it. Ground observers who saw All-American limping overhead with its rear fuselage torn open could hardly believe the aircraft was still airborne. Reports flooded into RAF Fighter Command about a severely damaged American bomber attempting to return to base, and fighter aircraft were scrambled to escort it. Several RAF Spitfire pilots later reported that seeing the damaged B-17 was one of the most astonishing sights of their entire combat experience. The bomber looked like it should be in 1,000 pieces scattered across the German countryside. Yet it continued to fly through sheer determination and the incredible structural integrity of Boeing's design. As All-American approached Basingbourn, Bragg faced another critical decision. Attempting to land the aircraft in its damaged condition could result in complete structural failure, potentially killing everyone aboard. The safe option would be to order the crew to bail out over England, allowing them to parachute to safety while he and Enniel stayed with the aircraft. But Bragg rejected this option. His entire crew had stayed with the aircraft through the impossible flight home, and he was determined to get them all down safely. He radioed the tower at Basingbourn and informed them of his intention to attempt a landing. Ground crews immediately began preparing for a crash landing, positioning fire trucks and ambulances along the runway and clearing all non-essential personnel from the area. The tower offered Bragg the option of landing at a closer airfield with better emergency facilities, but he declined. He had promised to bring his crew home to Basingbourn, and he intended to keep that promise at 14-15 hours. Lieutenant Bragg lined All-American up for final approach to runway 24. He had to maintain a higher than normal approach speed because the damaged tail created insufficient lift at slower speeds, which meant he would touch down fast and use more runway. He could not deploy full flaps because the increased drag might cause the tail section to separate. Every control input had to be smooth and gradual, as any abrupt movement could trigger structural failure. Co-pilot Enniel called out altitudes and airspeeds, his voice steady despite the tension. The rest of the crew had moved as far forward as possible to put their weight over the main landing gear and away from the damaged tail section. In the rear, tail gunner Covell remained at his position, unable to move forward safely, prepared to ride the tail section down regardless of what happened. The landing was a masterpiece of flying skill and courage. Bragg brought the bomber over the runway threshold at 140 miles per hour, well above normal landing speed, and gently eased it down onto the main wheels. The instant the wheels touched, he pulled the throttles to idle and stood on the brakes, desperate to slow the aircraft before the damaged structure failed under the stress of landing. The tail section held miraculously as the bomber rolled down the runway, trailing sparks from dragging metal. The tailwheel assembly was damaged and couldn't be lowered, so the rear fuselage was essentially dragging on the runway surface, but the main structure held together. After what seemed like an eternity but was actually only about 30 seconds, All-American rolled to a stop about 3,000 feet down the runway. For a moment there was absolute silence as the engines wound down. Then the tower erupted in cheers, and emergency vehicles rushed toward the bomber. The crew began evacuating immediately following emergency procedures, even though the aircraft was no longer in immediate danger. The first men out were the waist gunners, who simply stepped through the gaping hole where the fuselage used to be. They were followed by other crew members climbing through hatches and doors. Tail gunner Covell had to wait for ground crews to reach his position and help him out of the tail section, as the surrounding structure was too damaged for him to safely exit on his own. When all 10 crew members had assembled on the runway beside their battered bomber, the full impact of what they had accomplished became clear. They had flown an aircraft that, by all logic, should have broken apart in midair, bringing it more than 300 miles across enemy territory in the English Channel, and landed it safely with all crew surviving. Not one of the 10 men had suffered injuries more serious than bruises and minor cuts. They stood together looking at All-American, and what they saw was almost impossible to believe. The rear fuselage was opened up like a tin can, with structural members bent and twisted, skin panels torn away, and the tail section attached only by the lower fuselage structure and a few control cables. Daylight was clearly visible through the aircraft from one side to the other. Ground crews and engineering officers who examined the bomber were stunned. One engineer later stated that he would not have believed the aircraft could fly in that condition if he had not seen it with his own eyes. The structural damage was so extensive that All-American was declared a total loss and never flew again. Instead, it became a training aid, used to teach aircraft mechanics about B-17 structure and to demonstrate to crews the incredible ruggedness of the Flying Fortress design. The story of All-American and its impossible flight spread rapidly through the 8th Air Force and became one of the most famous survival stories of the bombing campaign. Photographs of the damaged aircraft were widely distributed and had a significant impact on crew morale. B-17 crews who saw those photos gained confidence that their aircraft could bring them home even if catastrophically damaged. The bomber's survival also validated Boeing's design philosophy, which emphasized structural redundancy and robustness. Meanwhile, back in Germany, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler filed a routine after-action report that made no mention of his decision to escort the damaged American bomber rather than destroy it. He continued flying combat missions and eventually achieved 28 confirmed kills before war's end. But he never forgot the damaged B-17 with its exposed crew, and he never regretted his decision to spare them. After the war, Stigler emigrated to Canada and rarely spoke about his combat experiences. For decades, the American and German participants in this extraordinary encounter knew nothing of each other. Lieutenant Bragg and his crew were debriefed extensively about the mission, and Bragg received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his exceptional airmanship in bringing the crippled bomber home. His crew members also received commendations for their performance under extreme stress. The mission report included detailed descriptions of the damage and the flight characteristics of the crippled aircraft, information that was forwarded to Boeing engineers for analysis. Boeing's engineers studied the photographs and damage reports from All-American with intense interest. The fact that the aircraft had remained flyable despite losing most of its rear fuselage provided valuable data about structural load paths and failure modes. Engineers noted that the lower fuselage structure, which included heavy longitudinal beams and the keel structure, had remained intact and provided sufficient rigidity to keep the tail attached. The B-17's design included multiple redundant load paths, meaning that even when primary structures failed, secondary structures could carry loads temporarily. This redundancy had saved All-American and its crew. The lessons learned from All-American survival influenced the design of later Boeing aircraft, including the B-29 Superfortress and eventually civilian airliners. The principle that aircraft should be able to sustain battle damage and remain flyable became even more firmly embedded in Boeing's design philosophy. The company's engineers recognized that structural strength and redundancy were not just theoretical ideals but practical necessities that saved lives in combat conditions. In the years immediately following the war, Bragg and his crew occasionally reunited at squadron gatherings and maintained contact through letters and phone calls. They remained close, bound by their shared experience and the knowledge that they had survived something that should have killed them. Several crew members, including tail gunner Covell, credited Lieutenant Bragg's decision not to bail out and his exceptional flying skill with saving their lives. They recognized that abandoning the aircraft, which would have been the textbook response to such damage, would have meant leaving Covell trapped in the tail section with no possibility of escape. By choosing to fly the crippled bomber home, Bragg had given all of them a chance at survival. The story of All-American remained relatively well known within aviation circles but was not widely publicized to the general public for many years. That changed in 1990 when a remarkable sequence of events began to unfold. Charlie Brown, who, as Lieutenant Bragg, had piloted All-American that day in 1943, had spent decades wondering about the German fighter pilot who had escorted his crippled bomber instead of destroying it. He had never been able to identify the pilot or understand why a Luftwaffe fighter ace would spare an enemy bomber. In 1990, Brown placed a notice in a newsletter for former Luftwaffe pilots, describing the incident and asking if anyone remembered or had information about the German pilot involved. Months passed with no response, and Brown began to think he would never learn the identity of the man who had shown such extraordinary humanity in the midst of war. Then, in early 1990, Brown received a letter from Canada. Franz Stigler, reading the newsletter by chance, had immediately recognized the description of the incident. After nearly 50 years of silence, Stigler wrote to Brown describing the encounter from his perspective. He explained that he had been the German pilot flying alongside All-American that day, that he had chosen to escort rather than attack because he could not bring himself to fire on such a helpless aircraft and crew, and that he had never reported the incident because it would have resulted in his court-martial for dereliction of duty. Brown was astonished to finally learn the identity of the German pilot who had saved his crew. The two men began corresponding and eventually met in person in 1990, despite having been enemies in war. They developed a deep friendship based on mutual respect and shared understanding of what they had experienced that day in 1943. They appeared together at numerous air shows, veterans gatherings, and historical conferences, telling their story to audiences who were moved by this example of humanity transcending the brutality of war. Stigler and Brown's friendship lasted until both men passed away in 2008 within months of each other. Their story was documented in the book A Higher Call by Adam Makos, which provided extensive details about both men's lives and their extraordinary encounter. The book became a bestseller and brought the story of All-American and its impossible flight to a much wider audience. The technical analysis of how All-American managed to fly with such catastrophic damage has fascinated engineers and aviation experts for decades. Computer modeling and structural analysis conducted in recent years has confirmed that the bomber was operating on the very edge of structural failure throughout its flight home. The tail section was subjected to aerodynamic loads that exceeded its designed limits, held on only because the lower fuselage structure, which was over-engineered for normal operations, provided just enough strength to prevent complete separation. Any additional stress, such as severe turbulence, aggressive maneuvering, or structural fatigue from the existing damage, would likely have caused catastrophic failure. The fact that Lieutenant Bragg flew the aircraft smoothly and avoided any abrupt control inputs was critical to maintaining the minimal structural integrity. that kept the tail attached. Modern analysis suggests that all-American survival was a combination of excellent design, exceptional piloting, and considerable luck. The bomber operated in a narrow window where forces were perfectly balanced between sufficient structural strength to hold together and insufficient stress to cause complete failure. This window probably existed for only a few hours before metal fatigue and accumulated stress would have caused failure. Regardless of how carefully the aircraft was flown, Bragg managed to land the bomber within that window, demonstrating not just flying skill but also an intuitive understanding of his aircraft's limits. The story of All-American has also been analyzed from a psychological and decision-making perspective. Lieutenant Bragg's choice to attempt flying the damaged bomber home rather than ordering his crew to bail out has been cited in military leadership courses as an example of calculated risk-taking and responsibility for subordinates. Bragg made a decision that put his own life at greater risk, as the pilot would be the last to leave the aircraft if it broke apart, but gave his crew the best chance of all surviving. His assessment was that the probability of everyone surviving a bailout over enemy territory was lower than the probability of flying the damaged aircraft to England, even though conventional wisdom said the aircraft could not possibly remain airborne. His decision proved correct, but it required him to trust his own judgment over established doctrine and to accept full responsibility for the outcome. Modern Air Force leadership training uses this case to illustrate the principle that effective leaders must sometimes make decisions that defy conventional wisdom when they possess information or insights that suggest an alternative course of action may be superior. The story also highlights the importance of crew coordination and trust in high-stress situations. Every member of All-American's crew performed their duties flawlessly, despite being in a situation that would have justified panic. The engineer worked to stabilize the damaged structure. The navigator plotted the safest course home, the gunners maintained defensive vigilance, and the tail gunner remained at his isolated and dangerous position because abandoning it might have shifted the aircraft's center of gravity enough to cause loss of control. Each man trusted that the others would do their jobs, and that collective trust and competence enabled their survival. For the German pilots who witnessed All-American's damaged condition and subsequent survival, the incident provided a sobering lesson about the ruggedness of American heavy bombers. Several Luftwaffe pilots who saw the crippled B-17 later stated that the sight fundamentally changed their assessment of how much damage was necessary to bring down a flying fortress. Previous intelligence estimates suggested that concentrated fire into the fuselage or tail section would structurally disable the aircraft, but All-American demonstrated that even catastrophic damage to these areas might not prevent the bomber from remaining airborne. This realization influenced German tactical development in subsequent months. Fighter units received updated guidance emphasizing the importance of attacking engines and cockpit areas, as these were the only components whose destruction would reliably bring down a B-17. Attacks targeting the fuselage might appear successful, but could leave the bombers still capable of flight. The psychological impact of seeing bombers absorb tremendous damage and continue flying also affected German fighter pilot morale. Many pilots reported feeling frustrated that American bombers seemed almost indestructible, requiring multiple concentrated attacks to bring down, while even a few hits from bomber defensive guns could destroy a fighter. The disparity in structural robustness between single-engine fighters and four-engine bombers meant that the odds in any engagement favored the bomber's survival over the fighters, a reality that became increasingly demoralizing for Luftwaffe pilots as the war progressed and American bomber formations grew larger and more effectively protected. In the broader context of the strategic bombing campaign over Europe, All-American survival represented in microcosm the challenges facing the Luftwaffe in defending German airspace. American bombers proved remarkably difficult to destroy, requiring fighter pilots to press attacks to point-blank range and accept heavy losses in order to bring down significant numbers of the raiders. The 8th Air Force lost substantial numbers of bombers throughout 1943 and into 1944. But they lost fewer than German planners expected based on the volume of defensive fire directed against the formations. Aircraft like All-American that absorbed damage considered lethal but somehow made it home contributed to the overall sustainability of the bombing campaign. For every bomber shot down, another returned despite damage that appeared fatal. And the cumulative effect was that American bomber production outpaced losses, and the campaign continued to intensify despite German defensive efforts. The story of All-American and its crew also provides insight into the human experience of aerial combat in World War II. The crew members' recollections, recorded in post-war interviews and written accounts, described the surreal quality of flying in an aircraft that appeared to be disintegrating while maintaining focus on procedures and duties. Several crew members noted that training and discipline were crucial to their survival, as maintaining composure and following procedures kept them focused on actions they could control rather than dwelling on the likelihood of death. The psychological toll of the experience was significant. Several crew members reported nightmares and anxiety in the months following the incident, classic symptoms of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The Army Air Forces of the 1940s did not have sophisticated mental health support systems, and crew members were generally expected to return to combat operations after brief rest periods regardless of psychological state. Some of All-American's crew members completed their required tour of missions and returned to the United States, while others continued flying combat missions over Europe. The experience of surviving what should have been a fatal incident gave some of them a sense of invulnerability, while others became more anxious about subsequent missions, hyper-aware of how quickly disaster could strike. The engineering investigation of All-American after its landing produced a detailed report that was classified at the time but has since been declassified and provides fascinating technical insights. Engineers measured the deformation of structural members, analyzed the failure modes of torn skin panels, and calculated the loads that the remaining structure must have sustained to keep the tail attached. The report concluded that the aircraft should not have been capable of controlled flight in its damaged state, but clearly it was, indicating that Boeing's structural design incorporated safety margins and redundancies beyond what even the designers had fully understood. This finding led to additional research into damage tolerance and fail-safe design principles that would influence post-war aircraft development. The photographs of All-American taken after its emergency landing are among the most dramatic images of aircraft battle damage from World War II. The images show the entire upper rear fuselage torn away, leaving only skeletal framework in the lower fuselage structure connecting the tail to the main aircraft body. The tail appears to be hanging at an odd angle, supported only by a few remaining structural members. These photographs have been reproduced in countless books, documentaries, and museum exhibits about the air war over Europe. They serve as powerful visual evidence of both the severity of damage that B-17s could sustain and the skill and determination of the crews who flew them. The wreckage of All-American was eventually scrapped, as the damage was far too extensive for repair. However, portions of the aircraft were saved and are now displayed at various aviation museums. The instrument panel is preserved at the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum, and sections of the fuselage structure are displayed at the 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia. These artifacts allow modern visitors to see firsthand the structural damage the aircraft sustained, and museum docents often recount the story of the bomber's impossible flight home. In reflecting on the story of All-American and its crew, several themes emerge that resonate beyond the specific historical incident. The story illustrates the importance of engineering redundancy and robust design in creating systems that can survive unexpected failures. Boeing's engineers built into the B-17 structural strength and multiple load paths that proved critical when primary structures failed. This principle applies far beyond aircraft design and is fundamental to any complex system where failure could have catastrophic consequences. The story also demonstrates the critical role of human decision-making and skill in crisis situations. Lieutenant Bragg's choice to attempt flying the damaged aircraft home, and his exceptional airmanship in actually accomplishing this, made the difference between survival and death for his crew. No amount of engineering excellence could have saved the crew if their pilot had not possessed the skill and judgment necessary to exploit the aircraft's remaining capabilities. Finally, the story exemplifies how humanity can persist even in the midst of total war. Franz Stigler's decision to escort the damaged bomber rather than destroy it, at significant personal risk if his actions had been discovered by his superiors, demonstrated that even combat pilots engaged in killing their enemies retained moral agency and could choose compassion over duty when confronted with helpless opponents. His post-war friendship with Charlie Brown showed that former enemies could recognize their shared humanity once the context of war was removed, as we conclude this detailed account of how German pilots could not believe a B-17 flew home with its rear torn open and how all 10 crew members walked away. We should remember that this story represents thousands of similar dramas that played out over Europe during the air war. Behind every statistic about bomber losses or mission completion rates are individual human stories of courage, skill, terror, survival, and sometimes tragedy. All-American and its crew were fortunate to survive an encounter that killed many others in similar circumstances. Their survival resulted from a combination of excellent aircraft design, exceptional piloting, crew discipline, and elements of luck that no one could control or predict. The story remains relevant today because it illustrates timeless truths about technology, human capability, and the choices people make under extreme pressure. If you found this detailed exploration of one of the most remarkable survival stories from World War II informative and moving, please subscribe to our channel for more in-depth historical documentaries. Share this video with anyone who appreciates stories of courage, engineering excellence, and the resilience of the human spirit under fire. Leave your thoughts and reactions in the comments below, as we value our community's engagement with these important historical accounts. Thank you for watching this account of how one aircraft and 10 brave men defied impossible odds and how their story became a legend that continues to inspire aviators and engineers more than 80 years later. The legacy of All-American lives on in every aircraft designed with redundancy and damage tolerance, in every pilot trained to trust their judgment in crisis situations, and in the recognition that even in war, humanity and compassion can transcend the demands of duty and conflict.